Welcome to the last Let's Get Real program of the 2019-20. Of course, is about the 2020-2021 program. This was a series of programs that we've done this year, really designed around transparency and doing our best to let you know, above all else, I think, what we're thinking, what we're planning, perhaps a little bit of the reasoning behind why we do things. And we've received some nice feedback that people have appreciated our doing this type of programming this year. I think it was needed. And we definitely want to do that today as we're thinking about next year and what that's going to look like. I know that that is something absolutely on your minds, and it's something that we're working diligently on this year. This year, of course, school year not over, but almost over, very close. And we now want to take the opportunity to let you know a bit about what we're thinking, what we have planned for next year. Of course, there are many unknowns, more so than we've ever seen before as we head into a new school year. But there's a lot that we do know, and there's a lot that we're planning in terms of scenarios for the various ways some of these unknown things might play out. Our remarks are fairly general today for a couple of reasons. One, this is a K-12 program, and two, there are so many unknowns in different ways that things could play out in the coming months, but we're going to do our absolute best to, again, share what we're thinking in general terms today and give you more specifics through emails and through blogs or other ways in the coming weeks as the summer progresses. Received several questions in advance of this program, and we've incorporated most of them, I think, into our general remarks about today. Some of the questions are more specific than we're ready to answer today, but again, we hope to get the answers to those questions soon. And we're happy to meet with any of you by phone or further address things by email or on private Zoom conversations to address items that you brought to our attention for this meeting that we didn't get to answer. The chat is also available today, and you should be able to place questions in the chat, and we will do our absolute best to answer them, or at least get an understanding of what kinds of questions you have that we weren't able to answer today, so that we're sure to be able to answer them very soon. Okay. So in thinking about next year, we most definitely want to build on what we learned this year, especially, of course, since March, and also what we're going to learn in the coming months. And I've said this a few times, but it's so true. When you think about the current school year, it's really the first 2/3 of the school year, which was based on 40 plus years of history of Denver Jewish Day School, and just a wealth of educational research knowledge concerning best practices. And when you think about the last third of the school year, our switch to remote learning, there's very little research and very little experience on remote learning, especially with our youngest of children. So that body of knowledge and body of research is quickly accumulating now, and thankfully we're in an age when that information can be shared and is being shared and will be shared very quickly. So in the coming months, we're going to take the opportunity to, the coming weeks, coming days, to study that information, to learn what really worked well globally and what didn't work well. And of course, we have our own experience based partly on your input about what's working well and what has worked well this school year. But when we think about the upcoming school year, we have a number of things to think about. Of course, we're looking at things educationally. Next year, more than ever, we're looking at things medically. That's really an aspect that maybe we've had to think about a little, but now we're going to have to think about a lot. There are financial implications to next year as well that are different than they've been in the past, resembling perhaps 2007 and 2008 a bit, but they're unique as well. So there's only so much we can learn financially from our history. And then there's the moral concepts. Our values, our ethics, our midot really play heavily into our planning for next year, into the way we want to work with our students, the way, of course, that we deal with our own staff, that we've been able, at least this year, to retain everybody. That was a piece of moral direction that we wanted very much to take in order to limit the negative impact of the financial crisis of all of this on the people we care so deeply about, our own employees, our own community. As we plan to next year, there's one overarching thing that is guiding us, in addition to the 4 areas, the education, the medical, the financial, the moral items. That is our safety. The safety and well-being of the entire Denver JDS community really comes first as we think towards next year. It guided our decisions this year. And it most certainly is first and foremost next year. We want to be able to, and we can't use the word guarantee, but we want to be able to make our environment, our school, our community as safe as we possibly can for our children, for our staff, for parents, grandparents, volunteers, everybody. It's just so critically important in this day and age. So we're relying on guidance from the best sources that we possibly can. And there's a lot of different sources that have to do with, of course, the different angles of all of this. And we start with, I'll start with the CDC, who has released some detailed information about reopening for schools and what that's going to look like. We are combing through those details very, very carefully, and the guidance also gets updated and changed regularly, so we have to continue to comb through all the details. The state government is very important here, Colorado government and Governor Jared Polis, because he's issuing guidance that sometimes takes the form of law and things that we'll have to do. We closed our school ultimately before closed our school to in-person learning before the governor mandated it, but ultimately the governor did mandate that schools be closed for the rest of the school year. So we're very carefully monitoring not just the mandates, but we have some people involved that know about the thinking of the governor and where that's going right now. We're encouraged by his thinking now in the direction, as we understand it, that he's going to be taking, at least based on current circumstances. I also have to rely on Tri-County Health. The governor will issue edicts or guidance for the state, but Tri-County Health, which is the health department that we work under, their guidance matters very much as well, because typically, as we've seen over the past couple of months, the strictest guidance, be it from the state or from your local health department, is guidance you have to follow. Another group that we work carefully with in terms of their guidance is CDE, or the Colorado Department of Education. We're typically not required to follow their mandates as an independent school when it comes to the health and well-being and the way in which we reopen our school next year to classes. The CDE guidance is really important as they're thinking through a lot of issues and how to deal with them. They released updated guidance just yesterday that, again, we've been combing through. And then we have both local and national educational groups, which have been incredibly helpful during this time period. We're a member of the National Association of Independent Schools, and we have been able to participate in all kinds of webinars on a variety of different issues that we're facing now as an independent school. And the local branch of NAIS basically is ACIS. So I've been able to chat regularly just yesterday afternoon with all of the ACIS heads. We were on a call yesterday, and it's amazing how similar and reassuring how similar much of the information and the experiences that we've been having as schools over the past number of weeks. They're very much very similar. They resonate well. There's this interesting thing happening that that we're hearing as heads, but luckily all the Denver area heads seem to be hearing it together. Just that there are things going on in other schools that are much better than what you're doing. And then when we compare notes, again, they seem to be remarkably similar, both in what we're doing and in the suggestions of what other schools are doing also. That being said, there are some really good things that we've learned from each other that are going on in each other's schools, some of which I'm proud to say have come from Denver Jewish Day Schools specifically, that we've been able to share, and some things that we've learned from other ACIS schools. PRISMA is the National Association of Jewish Day Schools, and there's another group that we've been able to talk to and rely on and share information with. And the last piece I want to share with you is just the medical professionals in our community that we're relying on. Typically, it's either current parents or alumni parents, and we are and will be relying on them as well for specific guidance. As we prepare to open up, we have a reopening committee, which is essentially the leadership team and then some lay people as well, including some medical professionals that will assist us as we prepare to create a safe environment for next year. We are trying to rely on scientific data as we prepare to open. I think that's really important when considering what is safe and what is best practice. There are a lot of different ideas out there that are being shared both nationally through all of the bodies I mentioned and by our own parents. So you've been sending me ideas. Some of them are, none of them seem to be new. Some of them are refreshing takes that are alterations on what we've heard and what other people are considering. So I do appreciate those ideas, even if we've heard them before, to know what you're thinking and to come upon maybe an idea that we haven't heard before is certainly helpful. And again, we want to go back and focus our decision making on what makes sense scientifically. That especially makes sense when you're thinking about the calendar for next year. A number of people have suggested different ways of looking at the calendar. And this is an area where ACIS schools in our own city seem to be taking pretty different approaches. A number of the more prominent schools are sticking with their current calendar. I understand that CA, however, has changed their calendar for next year, and we really want to make sure that any decisions we make regarding the calendar next year, and it is something we're looking at and considering, we want to know as best we can, at least with a certain percentage of odds in our favor, that changes to the calendar make sense scientifically. There's the thought that if we start the school year earlier and take our break earlier, that would be a great idea, and it might very well be, and that seems to be what Colorado Academy is doing, where some of the even local health experts are saying that they expect a second wave to come anytime, and they're predicting October. And the change in the calendar that I've seen so far, the main change seems to be betting on or taking the odds that the next wave will be in December. And if that turns out to be wrong, changes in calendar have serious impacts on other issues as well. So I'd hate to make a significant change in the calendar that doesn't seem to be based in medical evidence and what is likely to happen. But we're going to look at that issue really carefully and see what the experts are saying in the coming weeks. There's one goal that we have in mind when we think about next year as we begin to get into more details about specifically what next year is going to look like. And that is that we want to try to have as much in-person school as absolutely possible. That is a goal. I want to repeat it, that next year we want to be in school, in class at Denver Jewish Day School on our campus as much as absolutely possible. And I think that our school's smallish size will now actually play to our advantage. And that's something that's pretty refreshing for me to consider, and I hope for others to hear as well. Our small size should really make our ability to be on campus next year as much as possible. It should turn it into a reality. We'll be able to adapt and adjust, as I think you saw this year. We were able to shift very quickly and between in-person learning to remote learning. And next year it could look like a number of different models. So we'll be able to, and I'll address what those might look like in just a minute. but we should be able to shift between those models from day to day if we have to. And I think that we have a distinct advantage over larger schools going into next year that may not be able to shift between scenarios as quickly, and also that will struggle to be able to have as many students or all of their students in school, depending on what the restrictions are put out by whether it's Tri-County Health or the state. We know that there are going to be number restrictions of people that can be in a classroom. We're waiting to hear what those are going to be, but they play no matter what, I think, to our advantage. I don't see how the public schools will be able to have nearly as much in-person schooling or larger schools as we'll be able to have. And I believe strongly that our smaller enrollment size will make for just a safer environment where we'll be able to promote the health and well-being of everybody in our community much more easily than I think others are going to be able to do. There are a number of safety precautions we're looking at for next year, and I just want to tell you some of the things that we're thinking about, we're considering how to do. These are all designed to best support the health and well-being of our entire community. And there are a lot of the things that you've been hearing in the public from things like temperature checks, and whether the extent to which we'll be doing those with all of our faculty and staff, all of our students perhaps. Social distancing absolutely looks like it's going to be a reality for at least part of the school year next year when we're at school. I think we have to be realistic about that. There's a lot of dialogue amongst schools about what that's going to look like and the reality of how it can be enforced and how students are really going to follow that, and how we as a faculty and staff, when a student really needs us, God forbid he trips and falls and gets hurt, how you deal with those kinds of things. I think we have to be realistic that it's not going to be perfect. But we are designing our school buildings next year and our policies and our teacher training and our student teaching around how we're going to make social distancing a reality at our school next year. Mask usage is certainly something that we're contemplating, both with our faculty and staff, students, and anybody that comes onto campus. We're evaluating what will work best for our schools. Hand sanitizer, hand washing is something that will certainly be a mandated part of our days. Individual supplies for all of our students. Typically, we share a lot of things next year, and we're not going to be able to do that most likely next year. We're not going to want to do that. Directional hallways is something that we're working on as we look at our entire buildings and facilities, how we can best manage our campus to ensure, or at least to make it easier to have social distancing. So you can expect when you come back to school next year that we'll have a lot of signage around the buildings that will have directions for where people can go. And how they're to travel through our building, considering how lunch is going to take place, whether that'll take place in classrooms or perhaps outside when possible in larger areas. We're working hard to determine best practices for cleaning and for disinfecting of the campus. That's going to look different next year and perhaps very likely incur additional costs for the school. Also, there'll be some retrofitting of classrooms with perhaps more desks than we'd like and than we've had in the past, but that we'll need that in order to facilitate the types of structures that we're going to need next year. We're doing a lot of consideration also around pods of students and how students in smaller groups will stick to those smaller groups and perhaps will interact in a more limited basis with other students in the school. So next year, and other students and other teachers as well. All of this is really in the consideration phase and the planning phase. It looks like if the guidance is this, then our plan is this. And if it looks like that, then we'll have to do it differently. There's a big piece that is relying on the number of students in groups that we'll be allowed to have next year. And I know that right now, you've probably seen that that number is 10. There's a big difference for us if that number is 10 versus 12. And if it's 15, that would be really wonderful for our school. I know there's been a lot of pressure being put on the government, and ACIS is helping that to make the number of students in pods to be larger than 10. So ultimately, we'll see where that goes, and that's going to greatly impact our planning and what school ultimately will look like. We're looking at three basic scenarios for next year, and then a hybrid approach for one of them. The easiest to talk about is everyone on campus at once. Just like it was for the first 2/3 of the school year, and just like we all like to have. Of course, that in its most normal fashion looks pretty unlikely at this point, at least for perhaps the first half of the school year. And then there's all remote learning as a scenario that it could come into play. It's not what we want to do, and it's certainly not what it's looking like it's going to be next year. As I've said before, we've learned a lot from our remote learning, and it will most definitely be remote learning 2.0, but it's going to be what's best for students, with us also considering what parents can manage. We have heard, and you've probably seen on the news as well as and in print, there's been a lot of articles about parents going crazy as they've inherited the role to a certain extent of teaching, and more than they ever bargained for. And there's a new respect for teachers out there, but there's a lot of desire to have teachers take on more of the direction for teaching if we have to continue with remote learning. So we're certainly looking at how that can be done, but we want to do it with all of the best practices that are developing now for remote learning in mind. The most likely model, however, is the third model, and that is with being in school, but a hybrid of different types of scenarios. And again, a lot depends on what the mandates are regarding the number of students that can be in a pod or in a group at once. But this is what we're putting the most energy into and plan to be in school. And it may be that we're in smaller groups, that we have to be in smaller groups. And we're looking at different models, both to have model A, everybody in school, but in smaller groups in different locations with social distancing in place, but also a situation where we can't have everybody in school. So we're doing one day we have one group, and the next day we have another group, and then perhaps the group that's not in school on their day where they're at home, they have remote learning. Maybe that will look differently than this year. But some sort of hybrid model. We considered quickly, 8 to 12 and 12 to 4 for the two different groups. I think that just looks like a real mess, but if you think that's something that you might be interested, we're certainly interested in hearing that response. And there'll be surveys going out also where you'll have the opportunity to tell us what you think of these different kinds of models. So that's the kinds of things that we're looking at for next year, but most importantly, we hope to be back in school, either with everybody at once, and again, looking differently, social distancing in place, likely masks and temperature checks and things like that to ensure as best we can the safety and well-being of everybody. But perhaps also with half the school in on one day, half the school in, maybe it's Monday, Wednesday, and alternating Fridays, something like that, with remote learning going on for the opposite group. And also consideration right now for those people who will not be ready to send their kids back to school next year, at least early on. There's a great deal of fear about sickness, I understand, and perhaps some people will not quite be willing to send people in, at least at the start of the school year, and want to see how it goes. We understand that, and we're doing our absolute best to be able to incorporate a situation where that, at least temporarily, will work for people. It's going to be tough, but we're going to do it. Last thing I want to address, then I'm going to turn things over to Alana and then to Jason. We are looking at the financial implications of everything that's happening at school, and I'm pleased to announce that our board has approved a couple of initiatives that I think will at least help. First of all, you know that we typically have a June deadline where people have to commit to the school for next year, and payments become, tuition becomes non-refundable. We are going to extend that to August 3rd. So moving forward, we'll send this out shortly in writing. Tuition will be refundable for 2021 up until August 3rd. So what I encourage you to do so we can do the best we can with our planning is, if you're not enrolled, you'd like to enroll, but you weren't quite ready to commit because of tuition being non-refundable, we're going to make it refundable, fully refundable until August 3rd, except for the enrollment fee. We also have a multi-phase tuition assistance process that we're going to incorporate for next year. So families with uncertain or evolving financial situations may have their financial circumstances reviewed and enrollment contracts potentially revised in August and then again in December. So what this means is, if you're on tuition assistance and you need us to look at this again, your arrangement, because your situation has changed in August or perhaps in December, we will take a look at that. And if you're not on tuition assistance, we can again look at that later in August, December, or even other times. And if you need additional support during the school year, we'll be able to do that. And similarly, the third part of this plan is that in December, we can relook at payment plans for the remainder of the school year, payment plans that you have. If you need potentially those payment plans adjusted, elongated for a few more months, we're going to eagerly do that with you in December 2020 of next year. What we're trying to do is really make public something that we do regularly, and that is we work with you. We want you at Denver Jewish Day School. We want to do our absolute best to let everybody know that if you're having financial challenges, we want to work with you. We want to discuss that situation, work through it. We've done it with a number of families since COVID-19 has started for this year, and want to be very clear that we want to continue to do that. Overall, we did take the approach this year that we have a kind of a sphere or a whole community of employees that we wanted to keep in place this year. And in general, that's creating a situation where we're not reducing tuition, we're not refunding tuition. I've heard of no ACIS schools in Colorado doing that. We're all kind of protecting the overall ecosystems of our institutions and trying to keep as much of it in place so as not to cause more financial harm to the entire community, but rather just choosing to work with people individually. Next year, it's entirely possible that our staff will be a little bit smaller because of all of these financial constraints. We're trying not to make that happen. But the financial scenario that we have in the world, in Colorado and at Denver JDS, is one that is it's struggling. It's challenging for everybody, but we don't really have any padding in our school. We spend 85% of our revenue, tuition, which is mainly from tuition and then some fundraising, goes to pay 85% of it pays faculty and staff, and the rest of it goes to pay expenses associated with just running a school. There's not as if we have huge reserves and surpluses at all that we can reallocate in order to make things work. We count on every dollar that comes in, so changes that we make regarding our financial system really impact the school, would impact the school in a significant way. So we're being very, very cautious about doing that, all while recognizing that people are going through a time of financial strain. There are more financial incentives or scenarios that the Board of Trustees and our Finance Committee are looking at right now, perhaps will be rolled out in the coming months. Meanwhile, I will put out in writing kind of a summary of the initiatives that we described today. I've said a lot. What I'd like to do at this time is turn things over to Alana first, and then Jason to address some plans and questions that we've heard for the lower division, Jason for the upper division, and then perhaps address a few more questions we're seeing in the chat as well. Thank you for listening to all that. I turn things over to Alana.
Thank you, Avi. So we are, like Avi said, planning for a number of different scenarios. And even within those three major scenarios of primarily remote learning, primarily all together in the building, in-person learning, as well as a hybrid approach, within that hybrid approach, there are a number of models being looked at and explored and planned for in order to really maximize using state guidelines, using what we will know as the summer progresses and as we get more information of how many students will be allowed in each learning group, really looking at all of those different scenarios and working as much as possible to create classroom environments, physical spaces, and staffing that will support having as many of our students in the building as possible at a time. We recognize that especially for our youngest students, they require a lot of support in the remote learning environment. So we are excited and very encouraged that it looks like we will have some degree of in-person instruction regularly for most of the fall next year. That might be in smaller groups, that might be on different days, but we are very encouraged that we can plan for times in which we will be able to have students in person in the building with teachers teaching content. That will allow us to rely more heavily on that instructional time and less heavily on, especially for our youngest learners, reliance on remote learning aspects of the program. That being said, as we develop the program, we recognize that if there are surges in the virus and times in which we need to plan for more heavily relying on remote learning, we are working to use the feedback that you have all provided in our surveys, in conversations with you, in emails, as well as feedback from our students, looking at engagement and performance data to see what worked well for our lower division students, what are some areas we might want to tweak and change going forward. So we do anticipate that remote learning, when and if it is in place next year, will look somewhat different than it looked now. We are looking at more opportunities for regular synchronous learning. There still will be a blend of synchronous and asynchronous learning in the lower division. But there may be more synchronous opportunities and smaller group opportunities for those lower division students. You know, to a degree, this year was kind of crisis learning, and it was a system put together quickly and tweaked and changed as we went. We're excited that next year that program will have the advantage of time and experience, and we will have the opportunity to work with our teachers to enhance remote learning, as well as we're excited that we'll have time with our students in the building to really prepare them to be more independent remote learners. That includes both training and teaching around the different platforms we'll be using, being able to live teach and instruct in small groups, in person areas of the content, and then have students practice and enhance those skills at home, and not have to rely on that remote environment for all of their instruction. We are, as I said, looking at, I'm going to even share my screen with you, just in terms of our spaces in the building and how it might look when we come back. We are working very diligently to look at all of our spaces and maximize those areas so that we can get either 10 or 12 or 15 students socially distanced safely in classrooms, and be able to have students, for the most part, stay put in their learning space, and teachers rotate around to them in the different classrooms. And those schedules will largely depend on what percentage of students we're able to have in the building at the time, and therefore what percentage of the time is in remote learning, what percentage of the time is in in-person learning. And so the more detailed schedule will be forthcoming as those requirements come down from the state. We also recognize that even when we are in the building, things are going to look different for our students than they typically do. And we want to do all that we can to support them, to help them understand and become comfortable with being in smaller groups socially for instructional times, having to wear masks, having their teachers wear masks. That's all going to be part of the learning next year and the social emotional curriculum next year that we will also address. We're also really committed to meeting students where they are and moving forward with their learning. We've been so pleased with the way in which the vast majority of our lower division students have been able to engage in their learning during this time, have really been able to continue to master those skills and that content over the course of the year. And we also recognize that if there are gaps coming in to next year, those will be addressed in the remote learning or in-person program that we have in place in the lower division. There were also just some questions about materials. Will the students be primarily working on Seesaw and Google Classroom? Will they also have the advantage of having things like their workbooks and textbooks and reading books? We are, if we have the opportunity, and we're very much planning on having the opportunity to have some components of in-person learning in the fall, that will all be in place. So yes, students will take their workbooks back and forth with them. Students will have materials assigned when they're in the building that then they will take home and use during remote learning time and come back. We still will rely on those online platforms because they're a great way for students to submit work and keep track of the work that they need to do. But there will be kind of physical materials as well. In terms of, there was another question about if there are kind of A/B days or different times that students will be engaged in in-person learning versus remote learning. Will we be grouping families together so that families will all be on the same schedule? And yes, that is the plan. We are very mindful not only of families, but also looking at the possibility of those groupings being based on zip code also, so that carpools can be still in place and workable. So some of that, like Avi said, we will be garnering some parent feedback on what may work better or not as well for families. And we'll be sending out some surveys to get more information from families on that.
I just want to add to that the system that we're working on for next year would likely be a mix of K through 5 students, and the same in the upper division on any given day, splitting classes in half essentially, not having K to 3 or K to 2 on Monday and 3 to 5 on Tuesday. Like it's possible, but most likely what we're looking at is mixes of grades. Alana, back to you.
Yeah, so another question that has come up is if students are, in these smaller groups and largely in the same space for the bulk of their day, and teachers are moving around, what's the impact of that on students and movement and needing to get up and move their bodies? And that's something that we're really taking under consideration. And so as we're building out schedules, we're building in additional brain breaks. We're building in outside time. We're building in opportunities for them to have a break in instruction, get up, walk outside, come back, so that they aren't just sitting stationary in desks for 8 hours a day. All of what we're looking at and planning is really based on the developmental needs of our different learners. And so there are going to be things that look different in a primary grades classroom in the lower division or an intermediate grades classroom in the lower division that are going to look necessarily different in our middle and high school. So with that being said, I'm going to turn things over to Jason, and we'll catch extra questions after he's done if there's time.
Wow, thanks, Alana. I appreciate all of you sticking with us a long time to sit and listen and try to process information. I will try to be both informative and be brief. Wish me luck. The first thing I want to say is that I ask all of you to keep in mind, we are, at least in the upper division, 12 weeks and 1 day away from the start of the 2020-2021 school year. That's if we keep to the same calendar. I just looked this up. 12 weeks and 1 day ago, previously was March 3rd. And I say that because I want everyone to consider how much different the world was, our world was on March 3rd than it is now. And as we project forward, the world is maybe not likely to change that much, but it's likely to change considerably. And because of that, we are going to have to be flexible. We're going to give the broad outlines today, as Avi said, but things are inevitably going to change, and they should change. If we believe the same things on August 20th that we believe now, we're not being thoughtful about this. So Avi outlined 3 basic modalities that are possible for the start of the school year. One is that we are all together in school. There are few or no restrictions. We know how to do that. We know how to do that well. We are preparing to do that if that is the happy reality. I think that's not likely by August 20th. But if there is very good news on the health front and we are allowed to be all together in that way, we are prepared to go in that way. The much more likely scenario involves, as both Avi and Alana have discussed, some sort of hybrid where a certain number of students are allowed to be in the building. And there's 2 basic ways that the government could mandate this, and we're going to likely take our cue from the government. One is simply to say 50% of all students can be in the building. The other way is to limit it by number of students per class. Increasingly, from what we hear, that's the more likely scenario, and that makes more sense when you think about it. I've heard numbers ranging anywhere from 10 to 25 students per class. If it's 25 students per class, we largely, with a few exceptions in the upper division, could have all of our students in the, well, we could have all of our students in the building. Our program would largely, with a few exceptions, look like it has for the past few years. We, of course, would follow all of the health and social distancing recommendations, but that one is easy for us to visualize. Obviously, the fewer number of students per class that you get, the more difficult it would be. Writ large, what we are planning is if the number is small enough, whether they say 50% of a given grade or your number of students can be in school, or it's at the low end of say 10 students per class, what we're envisioning is to run our schedule per normal every day. And when students are in school, they follow their schedule as they would in any other time. And for the students that are home, we would broadcast either via Zoom or Google Meet or another platform. We would broadcast that class out in real time. So if I'm taking, we'll say world history, and there's normally 20 kids registered for that one world history section, but we're only allowed to have 10 kids in class. The 10 kids that would be in school on that day would be taking world history. That class would be broadcast out to the 10 kids that were home. They could participate in real time. They would have the ability to answer questions of the teacher, participate in discussions. There are some challenges, especially around assessments with that model. We're going to do professional development with our teachers to prepare for that and get them up to speed on the best pedagogy for those scenarios. We are confident that we will be ready to go. It won't obviously be as great as having all of the students in every class together, but it will be pretty close, and there will be very little missed in terms of instruction. The scenario that none of us want to see, but we do have to plan for, is if we are all in remote learning to either start the school year, or if, God forbid, we have a second wave of the virus, as some are predicting, and we start in one modality and all of a sudden we're back to remote learning. We will be ready for that. The two things that we learned from our remote learning program this year was, one, students need more meet times with teachers. So we're going to build into our remote learning schedule more meet times. This year, most of you know, students met twice a week with their teachers in class. We're going to push that up to 3, maybe 4 times a week. Because we don't want kids simply staring at computer screens all day, we probably, if we were in full remote learning, wouldn't get to the 5 times a week, but we would add more. And we need to do more social emotional programming, especially among our middle school kids. That was felt, especially as this dragged on, the lack of connection, the lack of meaningful interaction with other students, the lack of our teachers being able to see our students and how they were doing. All of those things we would plan for and build more time in. There was a question in the chat about the HIP and art trip specifically. Currently, for right now, we are not planning to have any of our high school trips go in the fall semester. We haven't made, that's what we're planning. We haven't made an absolute affirmative decision, but we're likely to defer those trips to the spring, and in the hopes, obviously, it'll be safer to travel. There'll be more things open, right? There's no sense taking a group of kids halfway across the country to see the sites and have 2/3 of the sites closed. So we're planning to defer those trips to the spring semester with the hopes that they can be able to go as scheduled. Some of the other things Alana talked about a little bit in terms of having one-way hallways, trying to maintain social distance. In the upper division, it's not likely that we will be able to give students lockers. It's a small but important thing. It's hard to imagine during passing periods all of the students congregating at their lockers and still maintaining 6 feet social distance. That doesn't seem likely. We're looking at ways for students to be able to either store their books or have a classroom set of textbooks so they're not carrying around 50 pounds on their back, especially for some of our younger kids. That's a huge load with all of those textbooks. But it's looking like we won't be able to do lockers next year in the upper division. Small thing, but for some of our kids, it's very meaningful. So I just want to conclude by saying we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. We're preparing for all 3 modalities and even versions of that. So, for example, we may be able to have 2/3 of our students in the building. And what would that look like if we had to stagger it that way? We're preparing for all of that. The more time, or as close to August 20th as we get, the more time and the more certainty we will have with things. I know you all want as much information as possible so you can plan and prepare. I get that. I understand that. Happy to take specific questions either online or offline about the various things that you're specifically concerned about. But please trust that we are planning for whatever we are allowed to do.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you, Alana. I do want to mention highlight my appreciation for how hard our administrators and teachers have been working both this year and to plan for next year. There is, as you can see, an incredible amount to consider and so many unknowns and so much information coming out daily and changing slightly, but we are on top of it. And again, I want to stress that our small size will be a tremendous advantage, both in our ability to switch quickly between scenarios or make changes to the program, but also we may very well be in a position where, because of numbers and the regulations sent out, we will be able to have all students in the building many, many days, whereas other schools, just because of their sheer class size or school size, will be splitting into 2 or even 3 sections. And we are determined to have as much school as absolutely possible next year in the building. I'm going to go through some of these questions that I'm seeing in the chat right now.
I can take one of them, Avi. So
yeah.
There are a couple of questions that have come up about the pods, and in order to have more socialization opportunities, will those pods rotate? Will kids be mixed up for things like recess or lunch or social times? The current guidelines from the state are really encouraging more contained pods, at least in the beginning. And so we will be following those guidelines. There are some promising things coming out of some of the camp regulations that may allow us for certain outdoor times to be able to possibly combine 2 pods for a recess, for instance, while still maintaining social distancing outside. However, the current guidelines do say the kids in the pod should stay together for the most part. We are, though, looking at the possibility of those pods, depending on guidelines, being able to be changed, by month or, by quarter. And so there might be some opportunities for those pods to get mixed up and changed up a little bit for social factors or learning factors. But we are primarily right now, based on state guidelines, planning for the pods to stay fairly contained.
Yeah, when it comes to questions like travel, which Jason addressed regarding HIP, I think a lot of this will be driven by regulations of what we're allowed to do and then the health within our own community. For a lot of things, we will put down deposits on trips, provided they'll be refundable. We'll just exercise real caution, and for things that you have to pay for that we don't do, fees are something that we are refunding. Tuition not, but fees we are for things that did not happen. Also in here with incoming kindergartners bring a device into the school so that they can get used to online work. Alana, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's going to depend largely on the mix of remote time versus in-person time. But yes, we do anticipate that all students, whether it's a device from home or whether it's a loaner device from the school, that that device will come back and forth with them at specific times during the year.
Yeah, I see a question about, will teachers be given Bluetooth microphones to overcome the deficits associated with mask wearing by teachers? There's a great suggestion. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Something to think about.
So that
And
is
we're going to be,
so that's actually something we're looking at into those technologies, and we're actually also looking into some different types of masks. We do know that students' receptive language skills do often rely on their ability to see their teachers' faces. And so we're looking at both some technology assistance in that area, as well as some different types of masks that may allow our teachers, while they're engaging in direct instruction and socially distanced from the kids, to have a more clear or transparent mask versus the solid mask on their face.
Will smaller grades be taken into consideration because their entire grade could be able to attend where others might not that are larger? There are equity issues related to that, of course, but yes, things like that, all things like that are basically being considered. When will you know when we have a final determination about the next school year so you can arrange for things like schedules, sitters, and the like? You know, what we really want to do is send you information in June that tells you, based on the guidance we have now, here's what it's going to look like. But the issue of numbers, that key issue of how many numbers can be in a pod or a group, is just so critical to what we can do, because we want to have the most kids in place that we can possibly have. I guess the one thing I can promise you, or I think I can promise it, I can tell you, it's what we certainly hope to do and what we're planning to do. We at Denver Jewish Day School should be able to have as many students at school on as many days as any other school in the city. I see no reason why we would have less than other schools. So I think by attending Denver JDS next year, your children will be at school as much or more than anybody else in the city. I hope that's a meaningful promise. We're really working towards that as the reality. And it's been ultimately with dates and timing, you know, the camp guidance came out on Sunday or Monday of this week. I just found that to be incredibly frustrating and incredibly late. But that guidance is really important, and we're dependent on it to give you the final versions of what school will look like for next year. Outside classrooms or being outside, are there plans for that? Yes, it's better to be outside with the breeze and the air flowing better. So yes, we'll have frequently we'll have students and classes outside next year. That is one reason to consider shifting the calendar, because we do know that warmer weather, you know, from August through November is likely then in December. So no matter what, you can count on that. Also saw a question about why we think perhaps the two shifts in one day doesn't work as well. We're concerned about two things. One is our ability to disinfect or clean the building in between group A and group B. If you have group A in for a full day and that's all that's in, you can clean their germs at night and be ready for the next morning. If you have two different groups of students on the same desks, etc., door handles, if they have to be closed, that's a disinfection issue. And then we also have issues of the hours that our faculty and staff are contracted to work. So that's an issue also. Those are the two big concerns regarding a day schedule. In addition to carpools, we're going to do our best to have groups within zip codes or families attending in the same pods, but in some places, sometimes that may not be so easy or might impact people negatively. And to have people going back and forth in the middle of the day, if you're working, to pick up every day at noon and drop off every day at 12:30 or 1, that could present problems. All that being said, that door is not completely closed, but those are the reasons that we're not as optimistic about those options. Looking through the chat here, when I was talking, Jason, Alana, did you see any other questions that you're ready to answer? That's very nice. I see thank yous. We always appreciate that, of course. Middle and high school sports, CHASA has mandated pretty much middle and high school sports, and they'll determine on our behalf, at least give us permission, and then we'll have to decide if it's a go for certain sports, whether we feel comfortable as a school to be able to have that. Yes, I agree. The uncertainty is frustrating. I see that as a comment as well. I appreciate your sympathy on that one. Just know that I will tell you that we see the guidance the moment it comes out. We get text messages from the executive director of ACIS. I'm on the ACIS executive committee myself. We get any information that's coming out about what we can or can't do. We see that pretty much immediately. So that's at least helpful. We are now at 1:02. I think we've answered most of the questions. We'll go back through and look if there are ones that we haven't and try to get that information out to you. I want to be respectful of all of your time, and I see our people have already started to drop off. So with that, I think that we're going to conclude. So I thank you for spending your lunch hour with us today. It means a lot. Hope we've made a dent in answering some of the questions that you have, and at least shared some of what we're thinking about, what we're looking at as we move forward to put the best possible school year and the safest possible school year in place for 2020 and 21. Thank you again. Have a great day, everybody, and let's all stay in touch. Lee Hitrolt.